I'm Elle Wu, a client portfolio manager here at Thornburg Investment Management. Today, I'll be speaking with Josh Rubin, co-portfolio manager of the Emerging Market Equity Strategy. He'll be discussing his observations in emerging markets, as well as his recent trip to Saudi Arabia. One important factor to keep in mind when talking about emerging markets is that asset class comprises of over 25 countries. There are a lot of places to invest in when looking for strong businesses. One of the things we want to highlight in our Observations in EM series is different countries that you and your co-PM Charlie have gone to visit. And we're going to kick off this series with Saudi Arabia. Josh, you recently completed a trip there. Can you tell us what you've learned, what you've seen, what you like about Saudi Arabia?
Absolutely. Saudi Arabia is a very impressive case study in a combination of economic reform and social reform. It was actually my final international trip before COVID and part of my very first international trip after COVID. So not only have I been watching it from a distance for a number of years, but I got to see the bookends of the world closing and then reopening again in relation to COVID. I think if we step back just from Saudi Arabia and we talk about a few of the key countries in the Middle East, what we see are some very interesting and attractive secular trends or a secular foundation. The population is somewhat in between Spain and Italy, so a fairly sizable population. The GDP is also at a level of Western European size, and purchasing power per capita is kind of similar to Portugal. So in general, across the Middle East, you get an economic foundation that looks more like a Western European foundation. And add to that, the currencies are actually pegged to the US dollar. So as a US investor, you don't have currency depreciation risk like you might have in certain other countries. On top of that, the key countries across the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia in particular, are embarking on a process of really trying to diversify their economies. And so what they're attempting to do is that they acknowledge the hydrocarbon or petrodollar dependence that they have and have had for a long time. And they're expanding their sector exposures to tourism, to industrial, to retail, et cetera, and they're bringing women into the workforce. This is a very complicated subject to address in just a couple moments, but it is really important relative to some of the more common stereotypes about women's role in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is actively working to empower women in the workforce and change some of the customs that the West has become more accustomed to, sort of the Saudi Arabian stereotype. So if we look back into the 1960s and 1970s and the economic drivers of the US baby boom, a key part of that was actually women shifting from being housewives to entering the workforce. And very amazingly, that's one of the things that's going to be happening in Saudi Arabia over the next decade as well. So we think these countries are creating economic stability by diversifying their economies, and they're accelerating economic growth by changing the dynamics of the workforce. And ultimately, that should really support equity valuations, the opportunities for investing in the equity markets. And that's what we're very excited about today.
Now, we can't talk about the Middle East without talking about oil. What do you think about Saudi Arabia in relation to today's oil prices? That's
actually a really important point, and we don't want to run away from that fact. What we think is really impressive about Saudi Arabia, the government's commitment to diversifying the economy, is number one, we do tend to think about the volatility in oil prices as maybe driving volatility in economic growth across the Middle East. But actually, Saudi Arabia's economy is fine if oil is $50. Certainly they'd prefer higher oil prices. OPEC recently cut production a little bit to support or maintain a higher oil price. But in general, we think the Saudi economy can be diversifying and growing even if oil prices are much lower. Another thing that I think is a question that everybody may want to ask themselves is, today what we really see is Middle Eastern countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, making the necessary investments to increase their ability to grow oil production in the future. They're spending the capex to make that possible in 2025 and beyond. At the same time, we're really seeing most Western oil companies doing share buybacks, paying big dividends, or maybe investing in solar power or other renewables. We certainly support the energy transition, and actually, Saudi Arabia is embarking on its own energy transition, but for the next 10, 20, 50 years, the world is still going to need a lot of oil. And so what we really appreciate is Saudi Arabia is making the investments to grow its oil production to support the global economy. At the same time, it's making local investments to support its long-term economic opportunities as well.